I want to write on
Some
the
people,
table.
Yeah, there's not many tables.
No, that's why.
No, I can't set them up.
Tuesday,
They have a
Tuesday,
huge crowd
they
coming
sent
in.
us
What happened
home.
on
And, they asked me not to.
Here?
I was
Yeah.
setting them up.
I was in
Yeah, I hear you.
What?
Do you hear me?
on Tuesday.
Great. Thanks.
I had something at 10 and then a brown bag.
yeah, no, he is over there.
Oh, you were supposed to be.
Yeah, I don't know what they have going on at 3, but they have,
Oh, that was
right
good,
as
that
we
one,
finish,
they were both.
a huge group of 50 or 60 people
Oh,
are
it's
coming
on the
in.
calendar.
Too bad.
I don't know, they came in when I was setting up and asked me not to set up the table.
No rest for the weary, huh? You have to take them back down.
Hello.
Oops.
I just hope this works, I don't care.
I was just gonna,
I don't want you to
Still
have
having
me sitting.
problems? Really?
You know, tables are secondary. Secondary, you want to have a picture and sound, but.
Yeah, those are all good.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah.
I'm just saving these two.
Okay.
Sorry.
You've got the microphone there too.
you can sing.
Hi.
But you know what, it's sugar-free dark chocolate, so nobody should feel guilty.
Did you say dark chocolate?
Yes, I do.
Oh, that's not good.
Yeah, sugar-free dark chocolate.
She's a hot ticket.
Yeah, she is.
Isn't she?
Now, you don't hear her yet, because she's not on her mic, that's all.
Just makes us, yeah. She just
You
makes
didn't
us,
have some pictures to
Smile.
watch her, the way she rolls her
Oh,
eyes.
yeah,
Well, it
You
was,
don't get the
right,
full
Yeah,
experience.
exactly.
it was hard listening to her and not.
Yeah.
yeah, see, the,
I say to my husband, she should check her under her car every time she walks in. You know, with her mouthing off on food.
we don't have many people.
You never know.
That's right after us,
I do.
and they didn't want me to set it.
There's no love lost here.
Just so everybody knows.
No.
Put this here and I'll sign in.
Hmm?
I said I'll put it there and sign in.
Oh, you signed me in.
Hi,
Hello.
how are
How
you? I'm fine, thank you.
Huh?
Fine, thank you.
Oh, that's
Up and
good.
about, taking nourishment.
Sounds like a nurse.
I mean, yeah, how did you know that?
I'm a nurse.
Oh.
Been about taking nourishment.
See, you nurses?
Oh, did you?
Yeah, how about you?
No, no, I'm-
Okay, yeah, yeah, very good.
How is everybody?
good,
Yeah.
good. In your group?
Good? Getting out of school shortly. Patrick comes home the 5th of May.
I know. It's incredible, isn't it?
The more money you spend, oh, thanks. The more money you spend, the less you get for your money.
So how was
My-
the brown bag that you went to?
Granddaughter, who's at Lehigh,
Yeah.
senior, graduating,
Oh, right,
I don't
right.
know, May 22nd or something like that. And she's getting a little stressed, I think a little emotional. This is all over now for
Yeah, now it's the real thing.
exams.
Yeah.
Well, she's staying.
It's good.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, she's going to grad school. Anyway, she calls the mother yesterday and she said, oh my God, there's meningitis out here.
She is.
And, yeah, and she said, oh, she said, "What?" She said, I hope I don't get it because I would die. Says Kate. And Christine said to her, don't get meningitis and don't die.
Move over. You want to do that, then you don't have to get
That's
out.
fine.
She said, don't get meningitis, don't die until after you graduate. We spent $260,000 or whatever to get you educated.
Her granddaughter is graduating from
Christine's
Lehigh.
oldest,
Oh,
Kate, she's the senior at Lehigh, is graduating. And she called her mother, I don't know, over the weekend and said, oh my God, there's meningitis out here. I hope I don't get it. Because if I get it, I'm going to die. And Christine said, don't get meningitis, don't die. We just spent $60,000
Yeah.
on your education.
Right.
At least graduation.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my God, that's Christine's oldest?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
But I can hear parents saying that it's not
Is
like.
it in the school, in the college?
Hmm?
Is it in the college?
Yeah,
Kids?
yeah.
Wow. They're sugar-free. I didn't know it.
Hmm?
I said they're sugar-free. I didn't know it.
They're delicious.
Yeah, the sugar-free dark
I
chocolate.
don't think you can tell the difference, although
Mhm.
now they're saying don't have, what's that, fake sugar.
I know. I never had that. Did you ever? I never.
Because I always thought it was carcinogen.
Oh, I did too. Honest to God,
I'd say to
and I
Joe,
hated that aftertaste. I hated everything about it. I never.
well, it was very, very sweet. There was a bitter aftertaste. But I always said to Joe, "Quit, keep on having that, keep on taking that stuff." He says, "What's wrong?" I said, "Joe, I have 1 teaspoon of sugar in something.
I
It's far
know.
better."
You know, I'm a great proponent of stuff. I can't believe in all this fat-free business.
Right.
They add more salt to it to make
Yeah,
it
the
taste
sodium
better.
level is
So,
really
I
high
mean,
and all of
you're
that.
killing yourself with the sodium.
Right.
And you're not supposed to have sodium anyways, right?
No, I know.
But yes-
I don't buy
yes.
anything. I just go the natural stuff.
Oh, I get organic of everything.
Yeah, no, I go that route too.
But yesterday, some rep brought in lunch. Oh, and it was delicious. She had these sandwiches. She's out in Worcester. I don't know where she goes, but the food is really good. So she had these little sandwiches. They were small, but they were delicious. So I had 2 of those. Then she had a pasta salad. She had a regular salad, so I took it all. And the regular salad had, like Gorgonzola cheese or something on it and walnuts. And I'm poured the stuff all over it. And I'm sitting down, I'm all ready to take one mouthful, and they said, that's romaine lettuce. And I went, you gotta be shitting me. Why are you kidding me? No, and I'm shocked that I ate it anyways.
Yeah.
I said, if I die, sue them. But I haven't had romaine lettuce for a long time. Oh,
It was only one time though.
yeah.
The cut up.
And all this was cut up.
Yeah, you couldn't tell.
Yes, oh, yes, that was.
Did you say sign? Sign language is no voice.
What? By the way, what?
I said sign language is no voice.
We weren't here 3 minutes for the Highlander class, and they didn't get anything here. We had to go home. I'm pissed.
Really?
It's something. The
I
connection.
mean, are we gonna have an audio?
I don't know. Ask her. She's on her cell phone. Unless it's sign language.
Yeah, no, they haven't turned her mic on yet. I heard, they can hear us. I mean, they already, the main room checked in.
Did you? Oh, they're working on it now. Did you?
Let's hope we can hear her.
Did you sign up for the brown bag with Highlander?
Yes. Right after you told me.
You should write it in the calendar.
And how come Monday there wasn't a class?
This wasn't. There was something wrong here, and it happened last week. Remember?
Get mad, I'll get even. Woman is a
Oh, I was gonna get accomplished so much this morning.
Or did you?
Her great grandson was over.
Christine's, he's
That's one of the.
5 to 6 months old now. All he did was smile and talk and everything, reaching for everything in his mouth. You just can't get away.
No.
I mean, it
no.
just, I went over, okay, so many minutes, half hour maybe. Well, an hour and a half later, it was like, I should leave.
Janice, enjoy it.
Oh my God. It's
Enjoy it.
just, I know.
He's gonna.
I mean, a great grandchild.
Oh, my
I
God.
don't think I'll see that.
How about Kate, Princess Kate, out in her high heels, 7
With
hours
the
after delivery?
same day, right.
Can
Same
you
day.
imagine?
Yeah, but her stomach looked big.
Of course
in
it
the red
did. It
dress.
should.
I know.
I thought you
And
looked
someone
pretty
said, I
think
imagine she
she went
can't
in
wait to
before
get
that.
home, to get the heels off, to get in her sweatpants, and get the adult diaper.
I bet she.
Can you imagine
I
what
bet she was in the hospital before that.
But even
Yes.
at that age, I mean, she still came right out after the delivery. Only so many hours.
Yeah.
I kind of think.
But the heels are what killed
Oh, I
me.
know.
I mean, the dress and the hair and
Right.
everything was
Well,
fine.
I saw the red dress and I'm looking at it going, oh, your stomach was a little bit bigger.
But I mean, I think it's all right because she was going home. I'm sure there were doctors and nurses and everyone
Everybody's
at
there
the
going to take care of
palace,
her.
and she can just hop in the bed and
Right.
sleep everything off.
Just
Their
that
baby's got to be
Quick
well.
appearance
Yeah.
for the camera,
But
for the media.
she's a trooper.
But even the other girl that came
I don't know what
before.
it's part of. I mean, they have different, like once they had Turkish movies, I went to. No, no, that's not it. It's MFA's own program. Hingham, I think, are you interested? I think I didn't have the mic on. An Estonian movie shown at the MFA, 8 o'clock tonight. Are you hearing me?
Yes. Yes.
Hello, Hingham.
Yes.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay. All right.
So what was that?
She spent time in Estonia and Tallinn.
What buttons do I push for this thing, or do you do it there?
It was in the catalog.
Okay, but I better let you. There are a couple of authors that I want to give you. Yeah, that's so they can see the screen, because they don't see it very well without it. Wait a minute, I must have. I mean, I'd be drummed out of academic life if I didn't.
Bracelet.
Nah.
Look at the pocketbook. That's right from Italy.
The what?
The pocketbook's right from
Yeah,
Italy.
look at the bracelet.
I'm going to put it on something.
I think he had underbite or
Got it.
something.
The two authors. Okay, so before I begin, I want to give you those two authors. They're not on your recommended list because the Snyder only came out recently, and I wasn't sure about Masha Gessen, so I reread it now. And much of the material that I'm going to talk about is in her book. Most of her sources are secondary, so the same things I read, she read. But also she has interviews with a lot of people. But the most interesting thing, today we begin Putin, right? Okay, is the title of her book. It is The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. And that was published in 2012. And it's an easy read. And so those two books I'm adding to your recommended list. Now, The Man Without a Face, that tells you a great deal about what the situation is.
Tim Snyder.
Putin came to power, I think without anyone realizing. and certainly no one knowing who he was. The only thing that I believe was known from the beginning was that he was ex-KGB, but or FSB, um, which is what the KGB became. Uh, but most experts on their services claim that there's no such thing as ex. And in fact, the KGB, and this became understood when under Yeltsin there was an effort to um, do some reforms, and the man who was doing it referred to, and this is in quotation marks, active reserve. And this is very relevant to our discussion of Putin. The KGB has this active reserve. And what is that? Well, it's people who are put throughout governmental institutions, also private institutions. And Putin was reported to say to a gathering of what the Russians call siloviki, the power people, which are KGBs, military, etc., security services, that he was reported to say, "We've done it," when he became acting president. We've done it. This is, so you say that to, I mean, there's no way to misunderstand the meaning of that. So that's, I would say, point number one. However, it's not so clear what the implications of that are, because you could read that in any number of ways. But it's pretty useful to know that in any case. So now the question is, how did he make it? So I want to begin with an anecdote. I like anecdotes. I really should have a career as a bedtime storyteller. So there was this moment that we might call the food supply episode. Or more specifically, how about 60 tons of meat? Now, by now, you're wondering where I'm going, right? So, Leningrad, by then it was already, I think, had become St. Petersburg, had food shortages. Actually, all of Russia had food shortages. But the city council, with the mayor, Sobchak, decided to go into negotiations for food and to do it with Germany. So the idea would be that they would get these 60 tons of meat, and what would they give in return? Because it wasn't charity. Leningrad got a permission from Moscow to export natural resources, and you had to have permission to do it. And so the resources were, of course, oil, but also timber, metals, cotton, and other resources that that had been allotted to the city, and so they took it and they traded it for the meat. So far, so good. Now, a political activist, Salye, I should write her down too. Salye, in spite of the French name, she's Russian. She was the one she was on the city council, and she went to Germany to negotiate, actually not to even negotiate, it had been negotiated, she went just to sign it. She arrives in Berlin, and she's told, oh, Leningrad already did all this, we're done. She went back, And now she's really interested in this case. Well, I'll make I could talk about this for at least a half hour, but I'll cut to the chase more quickly. Leningrad never got any meat shipments, none. Well then, what happened to the resources that were sold to Germany? Nobody knows. However, Sally never sort of stopped. This became her baby. So now she's going to investigate what happened. And what she found, and she wrote it up in a formal report to the city council, and of course, nothing ever happened. But what the report said was that the materials, the commodities, were signed into a contract, but the contract didn't have any seals or signatures. This is a contract with the suppliers of oil, not the one with Germany. So, not an enforceable contract. So that's one thing that alarmed Salye. But then it gets more interesting. There were about a dozen of these contracts with a dozen suppliers. And there were kickbacks. Well, no, let's keep it clean. The sum of each contract, of that sum, 25 to 50% went to commissions to the suppliers. So far, so good? Okay, now.
She lost me.
You see where this is going, but it gets worse. What Salaya found in the end, through interviews and looking at documents, she really invested a major effort into it. She found that this case, the meat, was only about 10%, about 1/10 of the deals that were being made. And who do you think the deals were made? Whose office? KGB. Putin. It was, well, before he was president. This is when he was still in Leningrad, and he was in charge. He was put in charge by Sobchak, then mayor of Leningrad, was put in charge of doing deals with foreigners. He was, after all, fluent in German, which was regarded as a major plus. And he was considered, well, very capable, etc. So that was what he was put in charge with. Now do you see how useful this tale is? Because that shows the beginning of Putin's accumulation of wealth and the enormous corruption that surrounded all this. I still would like to know where the heck the meat went. I mean, that's a whole lot of meat, too, you know. But in any case, that's massive corruption. That's not sort of small-time stuff. So that begins with, now, what about the main story of how Putin came to power? Well, he played a very interesting role vis-a-vis Sobchak, which evidently eventually impressed Yeltsin. And the two things that Sobchak, the mayor of Leningrad, and Yeltsin, the president of Russia, the two things they had in common, they were both being investigated for massive corruption. Right? Now, when Sobchak was not reelected as mayor, he was at risk. Well, it was not even it was a sure thing that he was going to be indicted. And that's when he started to have heart problems. And he was even hospitalized, but the charges were there. And suddenly he was whisked out of Leningrad hospital and had to go to France for better heart treatment. And the crew later said that, well, Sobchak walked out of, stepped out of the ambulance and walked briskly to the plane. And he stayed in France briefly, and then he came back. Well, who arranged the trip? Putin, indeed. And then, when Putin became president, what do you think his first move was? To get the charges dropped against Yeltsin. Yeah, because that's what I mean, that Sobchak and Yeltsin had that in common, that they were being investigated for corruption, and for sure they would have been convicted because the evidence was so massive and the corruption was so massive. So Yeltsin was profoundly impressed by the fact that Putin was the one that saved Sobchak's hide. He was skillful. I mean, you need a little skill to bring a whole person out of a country. He was skillful and he had his back. He was loyal, maybe that's the way to put it. And Yeltsin was right, because Putin did that for him. Now, nobody knows whether there was some kind of a deal there, but Yeltsin put Putin in as deputy to himself, and then he resigned. He really was ill, and he resigned, and so Putin became acting president. And at that time, the prime minister was more powerful than later, and Putin made sure that it was the president that was going to be more powerful. He, virtually threatened his prime minister he used the word, kind of street language, stay off my turf, meaning the prime minister was not to engage in politics. And he didn't. So Putin held him to that. He promised when he got the position that he would stay out of Putin's turf. So we don't know. I mean, what I'm saying is result of a lot of research that people did, and mostly Russians. They were the ones that had the contacts and knew the people to talk to and so on. So that is the narrative. But we don't know the details, what kind of commitments there might have been, and so on. But Putin was definitely not anyone's obvious choice to succeed Yeltsin. So it was that kind, you had to sort of keep guessing about this man without a face. Now, he did stand for elections, and he won easily. There didn't have to be a runoff because he got 52%. And it's very interesting. Do you remember at the time when he became president what our media did? Any of you regularly read the New York Times, for example? Well, then I'll tell you, but you can go back and look for it yourself. The American media but most of Western media was not in any way critical of this election. And yet there were documented cases of ballot stuffing. People would come in with a stack of ballots. They weren't even subtle about it. But it wasn't as massive as later elections. But there was some of this. And there was all kinds of sort of small kinds of infractions where somebody brought in already marked ballots into hospitals. And what was, some of the other things, and this happened in every election, that people teaching at various institutions would simply be threatened with not having their contract renewed if they did not vote for Putin. And then the other sort of thing that was, I mean, the ballot stuffing, I think we've had that too. But what we don't get, and they did, was that competing candidates simply could not get access to media. They couldn't get on television. They couldn't get their views known. They couldn't in any way seriously compete. So that's a kind of thing that's more subtle and more effective, actually, than ballot stuffing, which is also more easily detectable. But all of this got much worse, and I'll talk about it when we get to the next challenge, a challenge that Putin had. Kasparov, the chess celebrity, he challenged Putin, and that was nothing subtle about how they dealt with him. But in any case, the election meant various things to people. You know, I mentioned the American media, Western media. They saw Putin in a very positive light, that he's a young man, that he is, even the KGB wasn't held against him because it was thought that, well, that means he was well educated and he's going to be effective. Sort of like Trump the businessman. But then you had some interesting things happen. Because he was not known, the man without a face, he commissioned, evidently, biographies. And one biography had something like 4, 5, 6 people working on it. This was a major production. And certainly according to Masha Gessen, the biography was thoroughly manufactured in the sense that Putin was determined to convey a particular image of himself. And most of it, I think you're familiar with, that he's not only masculine, but he's combative. Nobody crosses him. And he's a real street fighter. And then the biography was full of these anecdotes when he would fight somebody who, I don't know, said a cross word to him in school, in gymnasium, wherever, you know, that this started, I don't know, probably from infancy. Okay, I'm exaggerating. But as a child, he was like that. And so this was a cultivated part of the image. Now later, this turned out to be a problem. Remember Sobchak? So now he'd come back, he was in Russia, and he wrote a book at about the same time. The publication was about the same time as the biography was being worked on. And this narrative that Putin had about really how great he is, Sobchak evidently, and I haven't read it, but he evidently contradicted that. He had an altogether different version of what he was like. And I'm told that it wasn't particularly negative. It simply contradicted Putin's own line. So, Sobchak was tasked by Putin to go to Kaliningrad, which is that exclave, Russian exclave between Poland and Lithuania. He was to go there and Hmm? No, that's pretty mild. What an optimist you are. No, exile wouldn't be good enough. Um, no, so he was tasked with doing this political work in Kaliningrad, and he had guards, he had um, security with him, two men at a time. Well, remember, he supposedly had heart problems before, so he dies in Kaliningrad of a massive heart attack.
Was
No
killed.
problem. Man has heart trouble. He dies. Except the two bodyguards had to be hospitalized for mild poisoning. So, not just exiled, murdered. And evidently, because there doesn't seem to be any other reason than that he was contradicting what Putin was determined to have out there. Putin is maybe more than perhaps most politicians devoted to image making. He goes to extreme lengths to do that, including what you're probably familiar with, diving for amphoras in the Black Sea and coming up with one in, I don't know, 30 seconds, or riding bareback with a Kalashnikov, and bare-chested. Um, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, he takes it Blueberry Hill. Killed that song for me forever. If you haven't heard it, you should listen to it. It's a terrible rendition. And he's totally serious. He's not doing it for laughs. He's serious. Well, so poor Sobchak. But as this narrative continues, I'm going to show you that he's only one of, I don't know, 24 journalists, a dozen or so oligarch types and political activists. Murder is, I guess, part of the political narrative in Russia. And some are well known and got considerable attention in the West, but most didn't get attention. And the authors that I give you that are on your list, they talk about these. Politkovskaya is probably the best known. Well, maybe Magnitsky, the lawyer, he's maybe even better known because he was allowed to die in jail. He got peritonitis, and they refused to give him medical care, and he died. And so the United States established the Magnitsky Act. Are you familiar with that? Should I describe that? It's a little bit out of context because it comes later, but Browner, for whom he wasn't a lawyer, I'll do the details later, but he campaigned to have the people who jailed him and refused treatment, and he was also beaten, evidently, in jail, that they would be not allowed to travel to the United States, put sanctions on them, and so that was done. So there was quite a bit of publicity on that. But in any case, dozens of people, and in every case, dozens of people killed, and for each one, the issue was criticizing or reporting on corruption, and sometimes very close to Putin. But I should say that except for Sully's report, and you knew that Putin was in that office, corruption is extremely difficult to prove. On the other hand, how do you do on president's salary? How do you get, and I put down the number that somebody found. This was in '07. A person who was close to the Kremlin said that in '07, Putin already had over 40 billion with a B. So, you know, that's, but you know that's a difficult thing. Even in our case, if you remember, Nixon had impeachment articles drawn up against him. But the one that they didn't include, they had it in the initial list, but not in the final list, was bribery. Because it's difficult. So they got him for high crimes and misdemeanors, where the proof is at a lower bar. But bribery, you have to prove that there was a quid pro quo. Well, you couldn't. I mean, Nixon raised, it was about the milk subsidies, well, quotas, actually. And so it seems that, you know, the lobby gave him huge amounts of money, and then the floor rose. Well, but how do you prove that it was a quid pro quo? So in any case, with Putin, there is enormous amount of evidence of the corruption. But, oh, there's another tidbit about this. Besides the money, he also owns what is usually referred to as a palace, but Putin claims it's not his. But it has movie theaters and well, basically the whole thing cost over $1 billion. So I think that's more than Bill Gates' home, and he's got bowling alleys in it, or what does he have? I don't know. Horse races. No. But anyhow, so the corruption is not just a matter of what shows up in money, which, by the way, usually goes out of country. So, huh?
Where's it goes?
All right, who am I missing? Somebody was saying something that I missed? Was it Hingham? No. No, okay. Yeah, except the difference is that the amounts are by far bigger. Yeah, I mean, it's just, it's corruption on a massive scale. And so Russia is regularly rated, you know, there's that corruption table, you know, scale, and they're somewhere towards the bottom, I think 90 something, and there's only like 100 something countries on that. I don't know. I just can't wait to go to Russia and participate. And I wouldn't be that greedy. 1 billion would be totally enough. I'd be okay with 1 billion. Well, once Putin came to power, sort of semi-legitimately, I mean, the electoral corruption was not massive at that time. But there were several things that happened that, in retrospect, most analysts view as part of the election campaign. And that was blowing up buildings. You don't usually think of that as electoral politics. The idea was to create a terrorism scare. That should sound familiar. Do you remember when we had the threat colors. Yeah, and how it was that just before the election, the colors went rose, the threat rose, and there were threats announced in New York and BC. So we evidently tried to dabble in that sort of thing, but we didn't actually blow anybody up. Well, Moscow always does things bigger and better. So they actually killed hundreds of people in a series of bombings. And of course, who was guilty? Who was doing all this? The Chechens. Who else? Now, why the Chechens? Well, you wanted to have a war in Chechnya. So you had to show that it's a threat. That's one thing. But the other thing is that Russians are very, well, racist doesn't apply here because the race isn't different. How about just dark skin? Dark skin means you're suspect. And the Caucasus, you know, Dagestanis, Chechens, they have darker skin. So that's all it takes. You're a terrorist. And they would, you know, there are beatings of Chechens in Moscow. There are a lot of Chechens who work in the market, do trading, and also often engage in crime. I shouldn't neglect that. There is a kind of general suspicion of them and dislike and bias against them. So that helped Putin as well. So here is this man who is an unknown, has to have a biography written about him. And I should also mention that he refused to campaign. He never campaigns. This last election, he made a point of getting that across. He does not campaign. It's beneath him. I think that's how he views it. On the other hand, if you have other ways of getting votes, right? So the first Chechen war was on Yeltsin's watch. Now it was on Putin's, the second. He wanted to end, he was determined to end the Chechen effort to gain independence. So Chechnya is part of the Russian Federation, right? It's not an independent republic. It's part of the Federation. And they wanted out. And not for lofty reasons. Chechnya was really a kind of clan warfare state. They're not the most lovable, you know. They have clan feuds, and you know they do just great on killing each other. So that's, you know, one thing the poor Chechens had against them. But Putin was the one who was able to do several things. When he came into office, from that point, the economy between 2000 and 2008, when the first two terms ended, the economy grew by 7%. So that's big. But the biggest was that he ended the Chechen War and basically put in a puppet. And so Chechnya has been quiet ever since. And in fact, it was a Chechen who supposedly did Putin the favor of assassinating Nemtsov. That was, again, one of those things that are not definitively determined, but the Chechen leader bragged about it, so it figured, you know. So in any case, winning that war was a major plus for him. And now Putin no longer was the man without a face. He was seen as the leader who was a strong leader, and Russians have the word vozhd, which doesn't translate. It's not exactly Führer, the German, but it's sort of in there. But it means a strong, strong leader, not a democratic leader. Maybe that's the way to put it. So that was one thing that made him, well, enhance his popularity, because he followed Yeltsin, where you didn't have that. And the economy rising was a major plus, but that was on the back of the rising energy prices. So it wasn't the sort of effective running of the economy. And so these positive things, the economy, the end of Chechen War, and there were also other things. Russia began to have a kind of stable position in international relations, which wasn't the case under Yeltsin. I think there was overall this general feeling of stability following the years of instability with Yeltsin. So his popularity was very high until it dipped again, but then you could invade Ukraine and annex Crimea, and the popularity soars again. Now, in these early years, I go back again to the Western media. The Western media was not noticing what was really very dark clouds on the Russian horizon. As I said earlier, they saw him as a young man who's going to continue reforms, and so you still had that phrase being applied, Russia in transition. And if you recall, the foreign policy of Putin was still continuing with the idea that you're going to have strong relationship with Europe and the United States. And so things looked relatively positive. But appearances can be deceptive. What was Putin doing domestically? Internationally, there wasn't anything that was alarming. But domestically, there were many things. So I already mentioned about keeping Yeltsin safe. By the way, not just Yeltsin, but that meant the whole family. And the family was more corrupt than Yeltsin personally, who evidently wasn't, but the family was highly corrupt, including sons-in-law, which always. So after that, the next target was the media. Now, the media in Russia was in the hands of several oligarchs, not working together. They were independent channels, like Berezovsky and his Channel One. There were several, Gusinsky, who had a network. These were oligarchs that, among them, really had all the media except for the smaller publications, or some not so small, like Novaya Gazeta, which was the main outlet for investigative journalism, and that's a Moscow weekly. Novaya Gazeta means new gazette, new newspaper. Couldn't think of the word. And it was very good. It would publish these stories, and especially about the corruption, but there was no traction. it was as if nobody said anything. No traction because the other media could not pick up any, or would not pick up any of it. And political activists were really going nowhere in Russia. And so if you control the media, you control the whole thing, right? And even when Politovsky was assassinated, Putin even said that, well, it doesn't really matter because nobody read her anyway. Putin is actually just a priceless, nice guy. But unfortunately, he was right. Politkovskaya was not read. She was read by activists and, you know, educated people who were not in the thrall of the Kremlin. But that's not the mass of the many millions of Russians. And so the Kremlin really was not concerned about these smaller publications, but control of the TV, even more than any other, I mean, all the rest put together, was the main issue, because most Russians, even today with the social media and all that, still most Russians get most of their news, or all, on TV. Now, the oligarchs are a whole other aspect of not just Russian politics, but Putin's, as he tried to deal with them. So I should say something about how the oligarchs came into existence. I gave you that reference by Hoffman. Hoffman is the one who wrote Oligarchs. Yeah, my handwriting is deteriorating. I'll remind you that it was about the rapid privatization and so on. But you also have to keep in mind that these were men, and they were all men, who were very skilled. And I think none of them, of course, began in finances, because there was none. And they learned quickly, and they knew how to manipulate financial markets, and especially they knew how to deal with the government. Well, not because they were insiders, but they did know people. And sort of the most common thread through this is that an oligarch, well, before maybe they began to be oligarchs, would lend money to the government. So they all had banks. So you lend money to the government, and you lend it against some major resource, maybe a big factory. There was an auto factory, Lada, for example, or an oil property, or in other words, something very, very valuable. And you know what happens next, right? The government defaults, which was the expectation. And now the government defaulted on their loan. You now own the factory. I'm so sad that I missed that moment in Russia. That when you look at it in retrospect, it just seems so easy. And those who were involved, who were watching this, in retrospect, they say the same thing, that it was mind-bogglingly easy. and part of it was deliberate corruption, and part of it was lack of talent, lack of knowing how to deal with these things. There was a woman who was involved with the government side of this, who saw the problems with these loans, but nobody would listen to her. For one thing, they didn't believe it. It was kind of hard for Russians to believe that things could be done that way. That you could, for example, trade rubles for dollars and dollars for rubles back and forth, and if you're guessing right, you become a billionaire. Money trading, you know, that's not, I mean, that's something we do in the West, right? And in fact, we've gotten our own billionaires. Who's the major liberal billionaire? Soros. That's how he made his money. He bet against the British pound, rightly. It was the British pound, and that's when he made his first fortune. Well, once you have a fortune, then you just keep making more. So in any case, it wasn't that, you know, I just said it was easy, but you did have to know what you're doing. And some of these men were well connected. Berezovsky was actually one of the oligarchs who put Yeltsin into his second term. He would have lost, and they launched this campaign, and he won. And that was a reasonably, well, I was going to say reasonably clean election. It was clean, unless you figure an oligarch doing the campaigning for you and paying for it is in itself not that clean.
As after Yeltsin.
No, while Yeltsin was president, Yeltsin put him in as deputy.
Right. But then when he
resigned,
Putin just slid right in there.
That was legitimate, because if you're the deputy, you're next.
And then they had another election.
Right.
Was that right there at 2000?
No, well, it was still in 2000. So.
And then the next election was back, what, in 2008?
04.
04.
Right, that was
the second. Now, all these oligarchs and the power just got bigger and bigger through time?
No. I'm probably doing this, I'm enjoying the narrative too much. I should do it a little more quickly. They came into existence on Yeltsin's watch, because it was during Yeltsin's time that they did these massive deals, right? And the government loans, that was Yeltsin's. But then, once Putin was in power, because he wanted to grab the media, and Gusinski and Berezovsky, they're the ones that had the media, so he had to shove them out and grab up the media. So the two went together, getting the media and downsizing the oligarchs.
And that was in 2004 and on, or just
before?
Before.
It was as soon as Putin came to power, as I said, after, you know, keeping Yeltsin safe, that was his next move on the media, yeah. Which was, of course, very smart, because once you had the media, then everything else just falls into place.
So we had that all under control in 2004.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
By
so
4, it was done. But he kept tightening things. And part of it was tightening the electoral process, and the other was eliminating activists, political activists. There was a significant sort of democracy activist segment in Russia. Journalists, also politicians, and unfortunately, they often misread politicians. For example, they believed that Sobchak was one of them. And so they supported him. And the first time he was elected, it was very much an aspect of their support. Well, they were wrong. He wasn't a liberal. But he played it sort of both ways. You remember when Russia had the coup against Gorbachev, right? Well, what Sobchak did, that was that moment when you really had to show your hand. Are you for the coup or are you against the coup? And Sobchak played it both ways. He kind of disappeared with Putin, by the way. There was a factory that had an underground. It was kind of strange. And he, with Putin, disappeared into that during the coup. Supposedly he was afraid, well, for his life with the coup. But most analysts, and certainly Masha Gessen, considers that he didn't want to show his hand, so he disappeared. And so if the coup won, I'm one of you guys. And if the coup lost, yeah, I'm a liberal. And that was really his game. And evidently Putin's maybe also. I haven't seen anything to be able to read what Putin, where Putin was on this. There's one little sort of footnote. When he was inaugurated for the first time, there was this huge party thrown in the Kremlin, the inauguration. And Khrushchev, who was the KGB end of the coup, was invited. And nobody talked to him. He came to this and nobody talked to him because he was, with the coup. But that he was invited raised a lot of eyebrows. I love that expression, raising eyebrows. Anyhow, yeah, see, this is really a fun narrative, isn't it? I mean, yeah. Well, about the activists, there were two very significant figures involved in this. And one was Khodorkovsky, who was one of the oligarchs, and the other Kasparov. Now, Khodorkovsky is a very interesting figure. By the way, he ended up serving something like maybe 15 years. I even lost track. And he had to leave. He's in exile, I think in Switzerland. I mean, if you want to visit him, that's where he is. Which is a shame, because he evidently doesn't ski. I mean, why would you want to be in Switzerland if you don't ski? Well, Khodorkovsky owned this giant oil company, as well as many other things, including banks. They all had banks. If you have a bank, it's like you make money. So he decided that he was evidently influenced by American business, and that it was clean, that it was transparent, which most of our businesses are. I mean, they try to do things with taxes and stuff, but pretty clean. So Khodorkovsky thought, rightly, I believe, that unless Russia began to have corporations that were transparent, were clean, it was never going to modernize. It was never going to become competitive and effective economy. Makes perfect sense, right? And he was the first to institute these transparent practices in his own enterprises? Well, if you're on to your 40th billion, what is your view going to be about somebody who wants to be transparent? I mean, you kind of know, I could have told Khodorkovsky to either knock it off or leave the country.
Right.
Well, but he did it in a very sort of upfront way, promoting this, that corruption is corrosive, um, it corrodes the economy. And then he met with Putin. Well, I should rephrase that. Putin called a meeting of oligarchs and some others, these major business people, and that included Khodorkovsky. And what does Khodorkovsky do? Well, he gives his talk, which by now he'd been giving, and especially about tax evasion and all these corrupt practices and so on. And then Putin was reported to say, well, and he supposedly has this, I don't know if I've noticed it, that he sort of sits with one shoulder up and has a kind of a face on him. And he says, well, to Khodorkovsky, well, I understand that you try to get tax breaks and you know, maybe there's something to look into. I call that a threat in any language.
Yeah.
And Khodorkovsky was warned. He was warned that it's not looking good. And one warning was that there were others who were being arrested. Putin began to crack down on those that he considered in some way a challenge, or they had media control and that kind. In other words, it was very instrumental. And Khodorkovsky, evidently convinced that he had done nothing wrong, which he hadn't, why should he leave the country? Which is what he was being advised to do, or shut up. But and so he was arrested. He was arrested and charged with 7 counts, I think. Not one of them is credible, and those who have investigated these things make it clear there wasn't. He was not he wasn't cheating on his taxes, and none of it was. But he was convicted for a 4-year term, and then while he was serving that, he was convicted for more counts. So that's how he ended up being in longer. And then they did something else. See, this is what I mean by, in Russia, they do it better and bigger. So Russian law specified that you're supposed to, if you're jailed, you're supposed to be in an area that's accessible to your family. You're supposed to be near to where you are, where your lawyers are, where your family is. So they passed a law changing that. So retroactively, they now could ship Khodorkovsky way the heck out that took hours of flying, hours of driving, evidently something like 10 hours to get to him. And his mother, who was elderly, but had a terrible time to visit him. She evidently did go out there. So he was treated especially harshly for doing what really needed to be done, but it got to the core of what Putin was about. And as Dawisha, that's another name I should. Dawisha, she has a book, Kleptocracy, um, which lays out the corruption of Putin and those around him. Um, but she claims that Putin really has no other interest than to keep gaining more and keeping it. If she's right, that would really make sense why he went after Khodorkovsky in a more severe way than anyone. However, there's a qualifier there. Maybe he would have done something similar with somebody like Berezovsky, but he left the country. So most people who felt that they were likely to, who felt threatened, they left. Berezovsky, by the way, died in London. Let's see, what was the cause? Well, natural. There was also a woman who, well, she was moving something in her apartment. No, that was a reporter. He was moving a refrigerator in his apartment and fell out the window. And there was a woman that fell out the window. She was walking backwards. So, you know. There was also another incident. Well, when I talk about Kasparov, Kasparov attracted a woman that had been doing sort of PR for Putin, or she was on the team for Putin, and she offered her services to Kasparov. And so one evening they left their offices, and she lived near the office, and so she was walking home, and she said the next thing that she remembers was she was lying on this awning, a basement window awning, so it was street level, and she was really bruised up. But her purse, where she had her cell and I think she had her computer in it, nothing was taken, not money either. And she was hospitalized. She was taken to emergency. And then the next day, she went to the police station to report this. And the police said, well, you must have fallen. So it's pretty interesting. You fall and you get bruises all over your body. So she said, but I have bruises all over my body. So then they said, oh, it must have been a car. No. But main point, nothing ever happened. I mean, it was clear that the police were covering it up, and never mind investigating, you know. But she was severely beaten, and evidently for working for Kasparov. So in any case, Khodorkovsky then being a very particular threat, Kasparov also a particular threat, but of a somewhat different kind. And I always have to look for dates. Probably you've noticed that I never ever remember a bloody date. I should highlight dates. Okay, it was back then. Actually, I think it was 04, around there. Kasparov decided that he wanted to be a political activist. He gave up his chess playing career for that. He thought that Russia was really in a terrible state, that there must be change, and he was going to challenge Putin in elections. So what do you think happened? This now was a particular challenge of a different kind. It wasn't about corruption per se, but it was a straight-on political challenge, which, by the way, Khodorkovsky also represented, because there were these conversations about Khodorkovsky may be running, so that too was. But Kasparov was straight out. He's going to run. And so here he is. He's a star. I mean, chess players in the Soviet Union, in Russia, are venerated. They're stars. So it should have been an easy run. Well, by now you know what happens, right? So several things were going on. One, at some of his rallies, there was one in particular where young boys started throwing eggs. And the police protected them. And it was visible. You could tell that they were being protected, but they ran off. So these were just incidents. Another was he was to campaign something like 2 hours, 3 hours by air on a flight, and his plane was canceled. The whole plane, it just wasn't going to go. And the next one wasn't going to go. And he couldn't get out. Then there was a town, he arrived having had hotel reservations for himself and his entire team, and the reservations were lost. Then he had arranged to be able to speak at a library, sort of like Hingham. And when he got there with his team, they weren't allowed in. So they did it in front of the library. Then there was a venue where someone brought in a band that played very loudly at his venue. And then I already told you about the worker who got beaten up, signaling that you work for him. That's what you're likely to get. But then the other thing that was extremely intimidating, and that was the purpose of it, was that they were being shadowed. The whole time that he was campaigning, there were always and they weren't hiding. They weren't being subtle. So that means that was the point, to intimidate him and intimidate anyone with him. And of course, because it was known that there were people being killed, that was not a sort of mild caution. It was serious. So now that I'm on a roll, let me tell you about a few other just brilliant killings. And this one you probably are familiar with as well, Litvinenko, the one who was poisoned, not the recent poisoning, they're still alive, but Litvinenko died, and he was contaminated with polonium-210, which is kind of an interesting radioactive substance. It doesn't kill you unless you ingest it, and then it's deadly. So those who brought it, they weren't taking a major risk. But the narrative is very interesting. Again, it's a real, very particular challenge. What Litvinenko was doing, and he was a former KGB. He really was former. He became a whistleblower. And he went on air, on TV, with 4 of his colleagues from the FSB. And what they said was that they were given an illegal task of killing Berezovsky, that other oligarch, right? And of course it was illegal. I mean, the KGB did kill, but it had to be, they thought, a legitimate order. So you don't do that to the FSB. You do not do whistleblowing. Litvinenko was, he understood his life was threatened, and he fled. And then he had the problem of getting his wife and son out, which they did with Berezovsky's help. And they ended up in London. But why was he such a threat to Putin? It wasn't only the whistleblowing about Berezovsky. It was that Litvinenko was also investigating those bombings that I mentioned before. And so he was putting pieces together. And there were really intriguing pieces. For example, 2 recruits, army recruits, went into a warehouse. They were actually looking for sugar. And they found it. Sacks of sugar. Great. It was actually an explosive powder, but it was labeled sugar. Now, how is that relevant to the broader narrative? Well, because one of the later moments, there was a building where bags of sugar, labeled sugar, were found, but the local police, not being clued in, realized that it was this explosive stuff, and it was in an apartment building. And what did the FSB say when this was found out? Oh, it was a practice exercise. See, the thing is about Russia, as I said, bigger and better they do things, but they're not that good at doing credible lies. They're just not. I already told you about the plane that was shot down over Ukraine, right? And I don't know, did I mention an expression that Russians have, pil v glazach, which is dust in your eyes? And that refers to that kind of situation where you tell one story and another story and another story, and you just dump it there so that, people are in total confusion as to what? And that's really how they do it. So at this point, I want to ask you whether you see parallels. Five?
Yes.
Go.
Okay. One is the political candidate access to the TV time. The Hillary Clinton had tons of access. Bernie Sanders next to nothing. And even when they did talk about Bernie Sanders, they would tell lies. I think I mentioned that last week. Don Lemon was saying, "Oh, here's a video coming up about them throwing chairs," and he puts a video up, and I'm looking because I know about the chair thing. I saw a cell phone video of what really happened. There was nobody throwing chairs, just a bunch of people yelling.
Okay, next.
Okay. 2, they hate the dark-skinned people. I think it was Chechnya. Trump Muslim ban, and KKK supports him. That's another one. I think you're talking about, and I didn't catch this, does Putin have a son-in-law that corruption?
No, Yeltsin.
Oh, Yeltsin.
No.
Okay, well, Trump and Jared. Jared Kushner.
Well, now Putin, but then, no. But it was Yeltsin's son-in-law who was heavily corrupt.
And then there's the oligarchs that they lend money to the government, but the government just happens to
We
default.
don't do that.
Well, no, it's a little bit different. It's in the United States, there was the real estate crash, and I know the lobbyists got the government to loan the money, which
Freddie Mae.
they knew that if they keep pumping this up, and then you get the people doing the corrupt loans, and that's affected not only the entire United States economy, but the entire world. I mean, no,
You mean the
Russia, has
bungling and
Russia
all
done
that?
anything as big as that?
Well, I would say bigger because
I would say
it was
bigger.
more systematic. I mean, but I take your point. The analogies are not that far-fetched. I think that's very good thinking, actually. I like that. The
And then
bungling.
My only
More?
other one is United States. We have for President Pussy Grabber, and Russia they have Pussy Riot.
You explain the, Murdoch, I think it's Murdoch, when Putin gave up the presidency, I think there was term
Oh,
limits. at one time.
Medved.
Mended. I was wondering if you could explain that. I think that was kind of an interesting.
Yeah, well, Medvedev was working with Putin in Leningrad, so they had that sort of past. And so he didn't choose Medvedev at first. He had this other guy that he talked about turf with. And that's one of those things we don't really know. Was there a deal between Medvedev and Putin? It could have been a tacit deal. It could have been an overt deal. But he brought him in and clearly understood that he is going to maintain control. And Medvedev is not KGB. He doesn't have the Siloviki around him. But he did have a circle around him. But they never gained the kind of traction that he would have needed to have if he were going to challenge Putin. But it seems that that was never in the cards. There was never going to be a challenge. There's no evidence of.
So there was a terms limit built into their constitution or wherever they're.
Well, yeah, but that requires a qualifier. The Constitution said you can serve 2 terms, and each term was 4 years. When Putin was, let's see, at the end of his 2nd term, they changed the law. So, actually, at the end of Medvedev, so they changed the law to make the term 6 years, and they still kept the 2 successive, no more than 2, but the terms were 6 years. So I figure that Putin is going to be in office till he's in the old people's home. And you never hear anything about Medvedev these days. He also made the position of prime minister more powerful when he was prime minister. And analysts of Russia are convinced that Putin really ran the show. Although he made a show of not, that when Medvedev was president, he's president. So, but we really don't know.
When did Putin get divorced?
When was Putin divorced? Fairly recently. He evidently had an affair with the gymnast, Olympic gymnast. And but I think his wife wanted Ludmila, I think she wanted a divorce. Putin was kind of an absentee husband, evidently. And so he remarried. He married the gymnast. And I think he had a child with her before they were married, which in Russia is, Nikulturna.
Yeah.
You know, Russia, in a way, is very puritanical. In the Soviet era, anyone in the Communist Party, you know, higher ranks, if you were caught, now it's not if you had an affair, but if you were caught, which is a difference. If you were caught, could be expelled from the party. That's pretty puritanical. So none of them, of course, ever had affairs. Huh?
She makes wonderful
You could
facial,
just kill people.
facial expressions.
That's interesting. I should have given credit to Putin for that. He kind of closed them down. They were very active during Yeltsin's time, and that's one of those things that Putin got credit for in stabilizing Russia. In Yeltsin's time, the mafia was the one that was getting the taxes. The government, the tax rate was something like 130%, and I'm not exaggerating. They had this weird system, and so nobody paid taxes. And so the mafia extracted protection money. And the tax code was reformed, and taxes became sort of normal, you know, whatever normal is. I don't know really what the rate is, but anyhow, so that it would be paid. And the mafia pretty much was closed down. There's a claim that there's still a Chechen mafia, and I don't know how true that is. I don't have a good...
But if the mafia's been closed down, who is doing the beating up of journalists?
FSB.
KGB.
The KGB. Yeah. I mean, they've been tied to these things. Again, it's not like somebody got put on trial and, you know, you proved it. But so mostly you go on circumstantial evidence, but the circumstantial evidence is so overpowering. And then remember Litvinenko going on TV and saying we were giving the task of killing Berezovsky. So here you have one case. I mean, this is 5 men, Litvinenko and 4 of his colleagues, making that claim. You can't get more persuasive than that, right? And so, you know, that's one that's totally proved. But the other cases, yeah, you know, you don't have that last point to plug in. But, you know, the bags of sugar kind of thing. And yeah, and that was definitely, that was another one that was linked directly to FSB because they said, yes, these are ours. But yeah.
I was wondering, there was a situation where there was a school.
Beslan.
Now I was trying to figure out, was that something, the Chechens were accused of doing that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Or is that, okay.
Yes, I was reserving that narrative for next time because we're doing 2 sessions on my favorite guy, Putin, or Volodya. You know, the Russians have like countless diminutives, so Vladimir is Volodya, and countless others. But quickly, Beslan was the case of Chechens taking a school hostage. But they didn't kill anyone. It was the special forces that lobbed tank shells into the school. They used flamethrowers at the school. 300, over 300, I think 317, mostly children, were killed. That was one of the most serious moments.
That was Chechnya?
Chechens were the hostage takers. But I want to, next time, I'm going to go into more detail because the details are overwhelming, including that the Russians were warned, including that the military forces prevented a mediator from going in who would have negotiated the release. It's just overwhelming. Yeah, but that's what you're thinking of, Beslan. Yeah. Dagestan, there was a hospital taken hostage by the Chechens in Dagestan, but that wasn't a Putin kind of thing or, anything with FSB. But the other one that we'll also talk about next time is the Moscow theater hostage taking, where over 130, I think, died because they were actually asphyxiated
They kept it closed.
from the gases that were used. I don't know. Am I getting? Is this too much of a downer? All of But I don't know if you remember when I first started OLLI seminars. I warned you that my favorite thing is war, mayhem, killing, bloodletting. So that's what I do. But I'm also going to have a very positive note next time. I won't even tell you what it is. So
We'll have to come and find out.
I'm going to give Putin credit. So anyone want the last word? Yes.
Actually, you can their own country.
War from the Peloponnesians to the present.
I did that?
Yes.
Gee. Okay. Yep, I'm true to form. What do you think, Hingham?
Great. Thank you.
Okay, group, so let's continue next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To one of his classes.